Topic for today is sort of cultural change and cultural backlash in the 20s. Set up by the attempts of political change and then political backlash, which also had a cultural element to it right after World War I. Well, those who wanted to restrict immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe especially, and also, by the way, the 1924 law also set up what's called the Asiatic Barred Zone, which is it banned immigrants altogether from most of East Asia, except for Filipinos, who were part of an American colony, American possession in the Philippines. As you know, the Philippines became part of American empire after the war against Spain, and so they could come more or less freely into the U.S. And by the way, just for those who don't know, before these immigration laws, except for the Chinese, people could come pretty freely. You know, if you were an anarchist, you were barred. That happened after McKinley's assassination in 1901. If you were sick, of course, the doctors found you were sick, you couldn't come into the country until you got better. But in general, except for some of those exceptions, you could come in because the idea was America needed labor. So most politicians didn't want to ban people coming in. Well, as I said, the immigration restriction laws of the 20s had one, you might say, positive impact on immigrant communities themselves, especially the ones that whose quotas were way down. I think the Polish quota was like 100 a year after the law was passed. And by the way, there's no family reunification either. 100 Poles was 100 Poles. It didn't matter who you were. They were able to stabilize their communities. And even though farms were not so prosperous in the 20s, and some of you know about that, farm prices went down from the heights they had gone up to during World War I. And so a lot of people had opened up a lot of land and mortgaged, bought land and got into debt and were not able to pay it back when prices went down in the 20s. But for industrial communities, it was a fairly prosperous time. And most immigrants who were restricted from bringing their relatives and friends over worked in major industries. So they were able to set up more stable communities without having a cousin or a brother or a sister or someone from their hometown coming over and say, can I stay with you? You got any money I can borrow until I find a job, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's in this period that you begin to see real serious institution of immigrant institutions in America, especially immigrant institutions from the more or less new immigrants, so-called, that came beginning in the 1890s in large numbers. Immigrant grocery stores, immigrant radio stations in foreign languages, newspapers, fraternal clubs, newspaper insurance societies, immigrant banks, and so forth. You get an Italian, a Polish, a Czech, a Hungarian, a Jewish middle class for the first time, really, in the 1920s. And also there's an important change beginning to happen in American intellectual life. The way American writers and intellectuals generally see the diversity of cultures in America. There's certainly still a lot of people who believe that America was founded as an Anglo-Saxon country and should always be an Anglo-Saxon country, and people who aren't Anglo-Saxons should be here in as small numbers as possible and not here at all if possible. But more and more professors of sociology and anthropology and even history in larger universities are beginning to adopt a set of ideas that we think of as cultural relativism today, or cultural tolerance, which of course is not the same thing. Or cultural pluralism is a better way to put it. Especially important in this, can you, next slide, were anthropologists. Like Franz Boas, who taught at Harvard. Franz Boas was an immigrant himself, Jewish immigrant from Germany, who did his field work among the Eskimos in Alaska and the Yukon Territory and other tribes in the Northwest. And he was impressed by the richness of their spiritual lives, by how their culture of fishing and hunting seem not to be primitive, as so many people had thought about native people before, but they seem to fit them into their environment. So really, something we now take for granted in any state park I've gone to in Minnesota, you hear about this, about Native American life being not inferior to other people's lives, but just different. Well adapted to its environment sometimes, perhaps better adapted than some of the industrial American communities that grew up around them. That was Boas's argument. He said that theories of cultural supremacy, quote, ignored the relative value of all forms of culture and deprived Americans of the benefits to be gained from the teachings of other cultures. So Boas, very important figure in a new kind of social science, which did not see there being a hierarchy of cultures, but saw all cultures being quite different, but nevertheless not some being equal and better and some being primitive and backward. Another important figure in anthropology as well, next slide please, was Margaret Mead. She wrote best-selling books. The idea of anthropologists writing best-selling books, this was new, which were based on her fieldwork in the South Pacific, in Samoa and in New Guinea. And she focused a lot on adolescence, on how people grew up in these societies. And she argued, going beyond Boas, not just were not these cultures primitive, but in some ways she argued they were actually more advanced. She thought that Samoans, for example, treated adolescents much more sensibly. They didn't try to repress the natural sexuality of young people, among other things, she argued. And for that reason, she argued that people were healthier psychologically in these societies. The fact that she wrote this, that she was a woman, tenured professor at a major university, the fact that her books were bestsellers, and she sort of went native in this way, all shows you that interesting things are happening, at least at the top ranks of American intellectual culture in these years. So all these changes, both social among the immigrants themselves and intellectual, began to make it possible for the recent immigrants and their children to begin to claim a stronger, more powerful place in American life. We'll see by the 1930s how that becomes a very important part of New Deal culture and the New Deal coalition itself. But first, of course, there are clashes between some of these people and many other Americans. And one of the most important sites of that clash is prohibition. Click, thank you. This is homemade liquor, but being made for sale. The Prohibition Amendment, the 18th Amendment of the Constitution, was, as I mentioned before, passed by Congress in 1917 and finally ratified in 1919 and took effect in 1920. There was actually an enforcement law as part of it. If you look at the 18th Amendment itself, it doesn't say anything about enforcement. So the idea of, the commerce and traffic in alcoholic beverages being illegal is fine, but if you don't enforce it, it's not going to be very much. The enforcement provision, thank you, was called the Volstead Act, named after a Minnesota congressman, Albert Volstead, from way down the southwest part of the state, so nowhere close to here. He was from, I wrote this down for you somewhere. I'll find it, but a district near the South Dakota border down there. The Volstead Act was, on the one hand, pretty radical, because for the first time, arguably since the Reconstruction years, since the late 1860s, early 1870s, the federal government stepped in to try to force people in America to stop doing something that they were very fond of doing, that is buying liquor. Now, I should add, it's a very important note that people often don't realize. One of the ways the Prohibition Amendment got through in the first place, and one of the ways arguments for Prohibition were made, was that people supporting Prohibition said, we have no problem with the individual drinker. We wish they wouldn't drink. We don't think it's a good idea to drink. But our problem is the people who prey on the innocent individual drinker. So if you look at the 18th Amendment, look at the Volstead Act, if you happen to get some liquor and are drinking it, and nobody can prove you bought it someplace, it's fine. You can make liquor, bathtub gin and beer, and even some people made wine. Though wine's hard to make at home. If you ever tried it. I tried it once, actually. Not easy. Wine tasted terrible. It was a commerce in alcohol. It was the big breweries who supposedly bought up politicians and bars that stayed open 24 hours a day, which they did in some cities. It was 7- and 8-year-olds going with a pail to buy beer for their dads. Their dads would drink it all and beat up their mother. It was that kind of thing that was the target. The leading prohibition organization was called the Anti-Saloon League. It wasn't called the Temperance Crusade. It was called the Anti-Saloon League. It was organized in churches, Protestant churches, and its leaders were ministers, mostly Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians. So the Volstead Act, again, was a very radical idea. After all, it banned a business. It banned a major business in America. However, Congress didn't want to make it appropriate so much money that it would be able to really go out and in a tyrannical way really shut down businesses everywhere. Because the people who passed the Prohibition Amendment were optimists, at least at first. They believed that an amendment's passed to the Constitution of the United States, the holy founding document of this country, and an act is passed to enforce it. Obviously, most Americans are going to obey it, right? And a lot of Americans did obey it, but mostly in areas which were already dry, which had already passed local prohibition or state prohibition. In the big cities, next slide, please. Well, here's a picture of, this is a common lithograph of prohibitionist propaganda. You see the drunk father and the children's trying to keep him back, and these kids are the mother's on the ground, and these kids are afraid of him. This was the picture that prohibitionists used to try to convince Americans to support their reform. And they saw it as a reform, and reform centered in the interests of women and children, by the way. The idea was that women didn't drink unless they were prostitutes or close to it. Only men really drank. Myth. And also there was the idea of bringing liquor across the border. If you lived next to Canada, as you all here do, I don't know the history of prohibition in Thief River Falls. Maybe you've learned that in Minnesota history, but I bet it wasn't enforced too well, because it's pretty easy to get, because liquor is never prohibition in Canada. So, and this is an interesting cartoon, because you see, I don't know if you can see the names. Can you see this? Southern European, XXX, Russian red. It combines opposition to those who flaunt the prohibition law by bringing liquor across the border from Canada, anti-radicalism, Russian red, and anti-immigrant attitudes. So all three. It's a successful political cartoon when you can hit three different hot-button issues all at the same time. And also sort of gangsters, tough guys up here too. So gangsters, of course, important part of the people who broke prohibition in many ways. So, but hold it there for a sec. But the problem is that Congress did not appropriate enough money and hire enough agents in order to really enforce the law, especially in the cities where, next slide. Can you go back one?
I'll try.
Up, you're going forward. Previous, yeah. Yeah. In the cities where respectable men and women were going to what we call speakeasies, all the time, and didn't mind having their pictures taken, sitting there having a drink. In many cities, the Volstead Act might as well have been a dead letter, though there were people who tried to enforce it. For example, and altogether there were only 1,500 agents hired through the Treasury Department to enforce it. 1,500. In San Francisco, where I used to live, and I wrote a book about labor in San Francisco, as I mentioned before, in a city of roughly 200,000 people, there were 9 agents to carry out, and there were 2,000 drinking establishments. The mayor of San Francisco at that time was a guy named Sunny Jim Rolfe. One of the reasons Jim was so sunny was he was a pretty heavy drinker, and he used to publicly flaunt the Prohibition Act. This was the mayor of San Francisco, who later became the governor of California. So clearly, Prohibition might as well have not existed. And also, the urban-rural split meant that some people who were flaunting it became sort of heroes and heroines. Next slide. One of them, one of the more colorful, was a owner of a drinking and dancing establishment in Manhattan named Texas Guinan. She was a former silent movie star who had a very popular speakeasy called the 300 Club. Her club became famous for its troupe of 40 scantily clad fan dancers and for her own sort of verve and charm and hipness. She was a real celebrity in New York and really elsewhere in the country too. She was arrested several times for serving alcohol and providing entertainment, but she claimed always that she was innocent. She claimed she never sold a drink to anybody in her life. She said all the drinking was people bringing their own liquor in with them. She just gave them a place to sit around and look at beautiful women. Sometimes there were accusations. The Vice Squad came in to try to stop the dancers from saddling up to some of the male patrons. And she said, well, they're not doing that on purpose. My club's very small, you know. That's the reason this is happening. They just have no room to dance, you know. They have to get close to the customers. She kept being arrested and kept being let out of jail. She had enough money to hire a good lawyer, and it was hard to get proof that she actually sold any liquor. And the 300 Club became a favorite hangout of the city's wealthy elite. George Gershwin, the great composer, often played impromptu piano there. Wealthy guests with names like Vanderbilt and Chrysler hung out there. Big film stars like Gloria Swanson and Rudolph Valentino made it their haunt as well. She earned $700,000 in 10 months in 1926. So you can see, which was roughly about $10 million today. And this is while her clubs were routinely being raided by the police. So, you know, it was a place to go. Manhattan. Manhattan. And her traditional greeting to her patrons was, "Hello, suckers." Well, all this obviously repelled a good many people in America. After all, Prohibition would not have passed if most Americans hadn't supported it. There were no public opinion polls at the time, but it's fair to say that the overwhelming number of Protestant Americans would have supported it, some Catholics as well, especially those who did not come from heavy drinking cultures, or cultures where drinking was part of the culture. As I said, the fact that those who supported the Prohibition Amendment said, individual drinkers aren't our problem, it's the interests, the drinking interests we want to turn out of business. That helped to mean that a lot of reformers sort of liked the idea as well. But there were leading American religious figures who were very much sort of cheerleaders for Prohibition. Probably the most important one, next slide please, was Billy Sunday, the most popular evangelist in American history up until Billy Graham in the 1950s. Sunday was a former Major League Baseball player, but not for the White Sox, for the Pirates. But he stopped doing that when he was pretty young and became a minister. And his favorite cause was Prohibition. Billy Sunday, by the way, I don't know if you know much about him. I don't know if you ever got up here to Minnesota, but he was brilliant at getting local churches to support his revivals. He'd announced 6 months in advance, the way Billy Graham later on does too, that there'd be a revival held in New York or Chicago or Minneapolis, other big cities, and then the churches would raise money to support it. And then people would come to that revival in the tens of thousands, and a lot of them then would go off and join the churches that helped to sponsor them. So it was a win-win for the churches. Even though they had to put out money to bring them there, they also got more people coming. So before the Prohibition Amendment was passed and afterwards, too, he was a major cheerleader for Prohibition. He took direct aim at people like Texas Guinan and her buddies. He called them the diamond-wearing bunch, the big automobile gang, the silk-gowned. In the 20s, more and more Americans were getting cars, but they were Model Ts. They weren't, you know, big, long stretch cars. He also condemned the low-down, whiskey-soaked, beer-guzzling, bull-necked, foul-mouthed hypocrite who beat his wife and neglected his work. He gave a famous sermon called the Booze Sermon, which compared liquor to a rattlesnake, to a voracious mongoose. And I haven't got time to do my Billy Sunday imitation, which I wouldn't do very well anyway, but he was a very vigorous, athletic figure on the rostrum, on the stage. He would go back and forth across the stage. He would wrestle the devil, you know, till he was down. He would punch the devil in the face. You know, he was he was an entertainer, one of those kinds of revivalists. Before him, revivalists tended to stay right where they were and give rather august sermons. He didn't do that. So this big government program was passed, and it was rather radical in many ways, but it proved very difficult to enforce. So in part, and only in part, a group grew very large to as many as 4 million members with an aim in part to enforce the law with vigilante action if necessary, and also to preserve the supremacy of white native-born Protestants. And this group, of course, was the Ku Klux Klan. Notice the poster, chastity. The Klan was a moral reform organization. I know that's hard to believe, but the Klan was much stronger outside states where there were a lot of black people. Its headquarters were in Georgia, and it had contingents across the South, but had many more people in Indiana, in Oregon, in California, in Michigan. Those are some of the centers. And there, its main targets were people who were not living good Christian lives. Husbands who were committing adultery, they used to tar and feather them, and speakeasies, or people who were involved in the liquor trade, whether or not they had a bar, in places like rural Indiana and some parts of Indianapolis had like 1,000 Klansmen members. It was quite large there, and very few black people yet lived there. Next slide. The Klan was, as many of you know, born by, created anew. It had been suppressed by the federal government in the 1870s when it just existed in the South during Reconstruction. But it was reborn in 1915 on the heels of the popularity of D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. How many people have ever seen this film, parts of it? Yeah. You know, powerful film. The first full-length feature drama film, the first film to use close-ups in the very clever, skillful way that he used close-ups, D.W. Griffith did. A thoroughly racist film, and yet a very great drama, one that's still very watchable, I think, in many ways, even though it's silent. I show parts of it to my class almost every semester when I'm teaching on this period. And so it was originally founded in order to emulate the great white Southern resistance of the Reconstruction period. But very quickly, with the help of some innovative salesmen who sold memberships very cheaply, began to take off on the heels of the anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic, especially, sentiment of the 1920s. And one of its major goals was to get people to obey the law, to obey the Volstead Act, to obey the Prohibition Amendment. Some of his leaders, you can go through it. Next slide. But I say, by the way, and one of the ways you can tell that it was not just sort of bully boy male organization was the Ku Klux Klan has many women members as male members. There's a group called the WKKK, the Women's Ku Klux Klan, which had its own officers, its own robes, obviously, and its own meetings. And the Klan, again, had an aura, at least, of being a reform organization, as long as you're a white Anglo-Saxon native-born Protestant, or at least white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. You didn't have to be native-born. Because it supported women's suffrage very strongly. It supported public schools because it believed that you wanted all kids to go to public school where they would learn a Protestant version of history, and read the King James Bible, and learn about the Reformation as a great event in world history. Not something Catholic kids, at least Catholic parents, wanted their kids to learn. Next slide. Here's some of the leaders of the Klan. Hiram Evans, the Grand Wizard, who was in Georgia. D.C. Stevenson, who was a leader in Indiana. And William Simmons, who was the one who actually founded the second Klan on the heels of Birth of a Nation.
Yeah.
My grandfather worked he was a farmer, but in the winter he worked in a clothing store. And I know the store that he worked on that ended up being targeted by the Klan in Cherokee, Iowa.
Why was it targeted, do you know?
Well, my Catholics that came through and, you know, messed up the store.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of fear that Catholics were gaining in strength and legitimacy around the country. There's an anecdote, I love this though, it puts the Klan in a bad light, but then, you know, as a historian you try to be balanced and empathetic, but nevertheless, obviously the Klan is hard to put in a good light these days. One point, a rumor went around in Indiana, southern Indiana, that the Pope was on a train going through Indiana. And so all these Klansmen and Klanswomen got to the railroad station, I forget the name of the town, and waiting to see the Pope get off the train so that they could then, you know, attack the arch villain. And it turned out there was nobody on the train but some poor salesman, you know, who got off and, oh my God, what's going on here? So you can tell, you know, the Klan was, let us say, rather paranoid. Well, scandals and bad publicity put the KKK on the defensive by the end of the 20s. Among other things, D.C. Stevenson, really the political boss of Indiana, as well as the head of the Klan. The Klan controlled the Indiana legislature for several years, was caught taking a 15-year-old, I think she was, a 16-year-old girl across state lines and raping her and leaving her in his hotel room. Obviously, that didn't make the Klan look good. This was supposed to be the great moral organization protecting white womanhood, et cetera. So the Klan fell apart in Indiana after that, and in general, more and more politicians who had sidled up to the Klan when the Klan was able to bring out a lot of voters found it embarrassing to be associated with an organization like this. And also prohibition was becoming less and less popular anyway. It seemed to be a law which was beginning to get more people to be criminals rather than people to actually obey the law. But the Klan was right about one thing, as I said, which is that crime in the cities was increasing, but it was also organized crime was increasing. Crime levels as a whole were not increasing, but as you know, organized crime was increasing. Next slide. Oh, I mean, here's a, sorry, Klan. This is Hiram Evans. Notice the way the Klan is associating itself with Americanism, always, and also with the middle class, American farmers and artisans. This leaflet, I think Faye made copies of it. This one, Weiss from a Klansman. Yeah. If not, I've got them. You can pick them up afterwards. You know, this is a very nicely targeted piece of literature. And this appeared in, not in a church publication, but in the Journal of Labor, the official labor union publication in Atlanta, Georgia. And the Klan used to have its own brigades marching in Labor Day parades in some places. So it really identified with the native-born worker, farmer, artisan. Next slide, please. This guy was not in the Klan. He would not have been allowed. It's not time to talk about gangsters and gangsterism in the 20s. It's a huge subject, of course. But a couple things to think about. First of all, most of the gangsters who really made it big and were known to the public were from immigrant backgrounds, recent immigrant backgrounds. Italians like Al Capone, Jews, some Germans, some Irish. But they were making it by starting their own businesses. Because, you know, you could argue they were shut out from some of the most wealthy, more established businesses. People like Al Capone were not going to get hired by a big insurance company. They were not going to get hired by one of the big banks, by Chase Manhattan. They were not going to become managers in U.S. Steel or auto companies. His people and people like him were the workers. They weren't the managers yet. That happened later on. So you can argue that, you know, without obviously thinking that mass murder, or organized murder was a good idea, that they were in an organized competitive business, and violence for them was a business tool. And also they were showing that a poor boy, like Al Capone was from the Italian slums of Brooklyn, could make it and could become, you know, a big man. And he was looked up to by a lot of people in his community, because after all, he was committing violence in the cause of being able to sell cheap and good liquor to people, which is a commodity they wanted. At least people in where he was selling it, in Chicago and places like that, wanted it. So, next slide. He also gave money away to soup kitchens in Chicago, in poor communities. So he was known as a philanthropist. And he was also, next slide please, a man about town too. Going to Comiskey Park with his son, and getting baseballs signed for him, sitting at the best seats right next to the dugout. He was not hiding out in the shadows. Al was, right out there. So this self-made man organized the rackets. He made them more efficient. One of the reasons he committed so much violence was to get those inefficient small timers who didn't really know what they were doing out of the business. That's the way he saw it, and that's the way some people who defended him saw it as well.
I think actually in that photo he is signing an autograph for...
Oh yes, he's probably signing an autograph. Well, no, he's got a ball though. No, he's signing a ball.
They're exchanging autographs. He went over and
No, you're right, he's exchanging autographs. Yeah, you're right. You're right. Good point. Good point. Just some quick numbers on his business. In 1925, he had a business, quote, quote, that generated $60 million annually. The payroll included at least 1,000 gunmen, who did other things too when they weren't shooting people. And at least 250 competitors were killed off by Capone's gang. Finally, however, he went too far. He planned and executed, while actually he was in Miami on vacation, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929. Next slide. Which was, photographers got there very quickly and took photos of it. It was splashed all over the place. And it was late enough in the game that a lot of people, just like people were getting tired of the Klan, they were getting tired of the gangsters too, of all this murder. It didn't mean Prohibition was more popular. In some ways it was less popular. But after a while, his law breaking had to be curbed. And so it was finally curbed. The federal government finally got him on the heinous charge of tax evasion. Not paying federal taxes on that huge profits that he was making. He was convicted in 1931 and soon faded from sight on Alcatraz Island, where he couldn't see all the open bars in front of him. Any questions on any of this so far? Okay, another indication of the new urban culture, both its allure and its perils, appeared on screen. 1920s, movies were the most popular form of entertainment in America and became even more popular with the coming of the talkies, the first of them in 1927. And Hollywood by this time was already a synonym for moral turpitude. Figures like Charlie Chaplin, the most popular comedian, were known for having mistresses who were 16, 17 years old, who he sometimes married and sometimes didn't. A comedian named Fatty Arbuckle, very popular producer and actor in comic films, one-reelers and then longer ones, was accused in 1921 of raping and killing a young actress at a party he gave. He was acquitted in several trials, but his career was over, and Fatty Arbuckle became a symbol of evil, immoral Hollywood stars. And there were also, next slide, sorry, Alien Nest, the Untouchables, who were very unsuccessful in Chicago. Next slide. Some of the biggest film stars also flaunted their sexuality on screen in a way that was quite alarming to older Americans anyway, but perhaps not so alarming to younger ones. And two of the biggest stars actually came from recent immigrant backgrounds. Theda Bara, for example, who played actresses who devoured men, in effect. She's playing Cleopatra here, with the eyeshadow and alluring dress or lack of dress. Her real name was Theodosia Goodman. She was a Jewish immigrant's daughter from Cincinnati. Next slide. The most popular male star of the era was Rudolph Valentino, from Italian immigrant background, who played, his most famous role was the Sheik, where he played an Arab chieftain, riding his stallion across the desert, defeating his enemies. He kept coming into contact with beautiful blonde Americans and English women who just happened to, come into his sight. And of course, he invited them to his tent for some coffee, and they just fell in love with him. These are not porno films. It didn't show, them actually having sex, but the dissolve would happen just as, they were going to the clinch. So he was amazingly popular, especially among women, but among some men as well. He was a new kind of Hollywood star. He was manly, but he was silky and seductive and smooth, and clearly he had no problem with breaking marriage vows whatsoever, either his own or those of the women came into his tent. When he died, very young in 1827, thousands of people swarmed over his casket and took away pieces of it. And his most famous role lived on in the most popular brand of prophylactics called the Chic, or Chic. Now, the films themselves were also, a lot of the films were sort of, had violence, had often violence against women too. One, if you can get that clip, one of the most famous of these were about gangsters, sometimes glorifying gangsters, or at least showing them unbridled. That one, yeah. This is 1931, Public Enemy. Can you full screen it?
Not before breakfast, dear.
Thanks. You can go back to the PowerPoints. You know, we've got inured after years of, of violent films to see this kind of thing. But in 1931, this was quite shocking to a lot of people. The whole sense of gangsters as, you know, resourceful, violent guys who become heroes, and the actors who play them, like Jimmy Cagney, became a hero. The idea of showing violence against a woman who actually just loves him, you know, has not committed any terrible thing. You know, it's a long time later in the film that he gets his comeuppance. Much, much later, not until the very end. How many people have ever seen Public Enemy? I recommend it highly. Great film. There were people who thought that this had to be reined in. There had to be some censorship of this kind of thing, both the sex part and the violence part. And in 1930, actually, it was Catholic authorities who were particularly concerned with the impact of this on young Catholics in the cities, who were actually going to more movies than people in the countryside. And they wrote, both a priest and a leading Catholic layman in 1930 wrote a production code and forced the industry to accept it, which regulated the content of the films and made that kind of shot impossible, at least in theory. But it wasn't really enforced until 1934, because Catholics not that powerful politically yet, and a lot of Americans were still going to these films and liking them. Even while the original production code was on, between 1930 and 1934, Warner Brothers, one of the leading studios in Hollywood, kept making films with titles like Naughty Flirt, Misbehaving Ladies, and Hot Heiress. So you can imagine these were, Hot Heiress was not about the mugginess in Chicago.
Was there any nudity in these?
No, no. Well, there was sometimes, again, someone taking off the clothes and then dissolve. So they didn't go that far. There were pornographic films that were made privately, but they weren't shown all over the country in big theaters the way these were.
Because I've read where some of the actors and actresses would actually go to Europe and do
Yeah,
films that
yeah.
were,
Yeah, well, European film was a different matter. Yeah.
they were full of nudity.
Yeah. Not yet. That wouldn't really come to the 1970s. But 1934, Franklin D. Roosevelt was president, and we think of him as a very liberal guy, but culturally, in some ways, the New Deal was, at least on these matters, more conservative. And Catholics were an important part of his coalition. Roman Catholic Church pushed hard. Roosevelt basically leaned on Hollywood studios to enforce the production code. So it wasn't until the 1960s that some of these pre-code films got back in general release again. Well, finally, a major battleground in the 20s, and throughout U.S. history for that matter, was religion, per se. That's Cagney and one of his leading stars, Jean Harlow. Next slide. Anybody know what this is? This is my own picture, actually. This is the courtroom in Dayton, Tennessee, where the Scopes trial was held. As I said, I wrote a biography of William Jennings Bryan, so I went down there to do some research and took this picture. Organized religion, Lynn Dumenil has a nice section in her book about organized religion, and she points out that on the surface, the majority of Americans belong to churches. In fact, for the first time in American history, a majority of Americans are actually members of churches or synagogues. And because of prosperity, especially in the cities, a lot of these churches had big building programs. So you have a lot of nice brick churches, sometimes reinforced concrete, and churches too being built in the 20s. And most Americans continue to belong to churches whose doctrine is that the Bible is the Word of God. But under that surface, attendance was down, and skepticism about the truth claims of the Bible were growing. A lot of factors about that, and I haven't got time to go into them in any detail, but certainly just to tick off some of them. First of all, the unpopularity of prohibition was beginning to eat away at it, because after all, the leading exponents of prohibition had been evangelical Protestants. Women were more independent. They've been the mainstay of the churches before. And in the 20s, I'll talk about this later on, women begin to wear different kind of clothing, begin to feel like they can have more independent lives. And sometimes it often means that they're really not as connected to the life in the church as they had been before. And also, there's the growing acceptance of Darwinian thinking among people with a high school education, which is still a minority of Americans, by the way. I don't know how many people know, but in the 20s, the only minority of Americans went to high school. It wasn't until the 1960s that the majority of Americans actually graduated from high school. But more and more, science and those who followed science was throwing doubt on the veracity of Genesis and other parts of the Bible by extension. There was a split more and more between liberal Protestants and more conservative Protestants. Liberal Protestants tend to say, well, we can have science and we can have the Bible. They don't have to conflict. There are different spheres of truth. And sometimes they come up with elaborate ways to include evolution in Genesis. But conservative Protestants more and more were calling themselves fundamentalists, which was a new term, by the way, because they wanted to fight back against what they saw as sort of creeping agnosticism. They thought if you accept evolution, then people will start doubting the first book of the Bible. If they start doubting the first book of the Bible, they'll start to doubt the rest of the books of the Bible, and then this will become an immoral society. This clash, as you know, came to a head in this little, well, not so little, courtroom in East Tennessee, the Cumberland Mountains, Dayton, Tennessee. And the Scopes trial, which the two main figures of which were two former friends. Next clip, please. Clarence Darrow, the most famous trial lawyer in America, and William Jennings Bryan, who had been one of the most famous reformers in America. He ran for president 3 times as a Democrat, was considered to be on the left wing of American politics. He was for nationalization of the railroads. He was supportive of labor unions. He was supportive of farm subsidies. He wanted to break up big businesses, antitrust figure in that sense. But in religion, he was, of course, very conservative. These are two major figures in American life. Everyone knew their names. Everyone knew their stories. And when they agreed to be the major figures, one for the defense of the school teacher named John Scopes, who'd broken a newly passed law banning the teaching of evolution in public schools, and the other one, William Jennings Bryan, who agreed to be a leader of the prosecution, all of a sudden the media, both radio and television and the press, began to call it the trial of the century, even before it started. Now, what's interesting about this trial of the century was that it was a lousy trial as a trial. Because the only reason why there was a trial at all is because this law had been passed earlier in the year in Tennessee to ban the teaching of evolution in public schools of Tennessee. And it was clear that the ACLU, this fairly new organization in support of civil liberties, was going to test it and try to get it heard by the Supreme Court later on. But everyone agreed that the defendant in question, a 24-year-old school teacher named John Scopes, had broken the law. Because this is the way that happened. I sorry to take you on a little longer here, but it's an interesting story. I don't know how many of you know it. But Scopes was a willing defendant, by which I say everyone knew there would be a test case of this new law somewhere in Tennessee. Dayton, Tennessee economy was declining. There had been mines there. The mines were pretty much played out. City fathers got it together in a drugstore across from the courthouse in the early spring of 1924 and said, how are we going to get this trial here? We need the money. And John Scopes was having a sarsaparilla, or some non-alcoholic drink. Prohibition did work in Dayton. And one of the leaders of one of the city fathers looked over to John and said, John, you teach biology in the high school, don't you? Yeah, I do. Do you ever teach about evolution? He said, I think I did. Yeah, let me look at the book. Yeah, I did. Yeah. So would you mind being a defendant, Scopes actually taught this chapter in a book called Civic Biology, which was the major biology book used in American high schools at the time, the chapter about evolution. when he was substituting for the regular teacher. John Scopes usually taught physics, and he was hired more because he was a good football coach, and the football team had been declining along with the economy of the town in Dayton, more than because he was a science teacher. So John Scopes, was not the victim, really, of the trial. He was a symbolic victim. And it was a very symbolic trial. Everyone knew that. But this symbolic trial drew over 100 reporters from around the world, a national radio audience, the first audience ever to hear a trial on radio. It became the touchstone for a debate that still rages today, of course. As Brian commented at the end of the 8-day event, here has been fought out a case of little consequence as a case, but the world is interested because it raises an issue, and that issue will someday be settled right, whether it is settled on our side or the other side. So the issue was not just whether you can teach evolution in a public school, but also whether the people of a given district have the right to ban the teaching of anything in their public school. It was an issue of free speech against democracy, because the people of Tennessee had elected this legislature, which overwhelmingly has passed this law. So Brian argued that public schools are public schools. People support them with their tax money. Why shouldn't they be able to ban the teaching of something if they want to? So that was an issue that was there as well, very much on the surface, as well as the issue of whether, of course, human beings had evolved from a lower species of being. Well, to make a long story short, and of course when you write a biography about somebody, it's never that short, but I'll make it as short as possible. The trial lasted 8 days. The first 6 days were rather boring, with some exceptions. There were some good speeches given. Because the first 6 days were pretty much devoted to the defense, that is Darrow, and other very good lawyers, mostly from New York City, he brought along with him, trying to convince the judge to allow expert scientific testimony about the truth of evolution, at least the overwhelming evidence in support of it. Some of those scientists testified, then the judge thought about it and decided that he'd ruled out of the trial and told the jury not to disregard everything they'd heard in the previous 2 days. They were back and forth about this. There were some debates about free speech in the courtroom as well as in the classroom, et cetera, et cetera. But after 6 days, nothing really had been decided. Nothing really had happened. H.L. Mencken, the great, cynical, brilliant journalist from the Baltimore Sun, who later on, his writings about the trial become quite famous, goes home to Baltimore. He thinks it's all over. It's boring. I'm going home. But on the 7th day, something really very interesting does happen. The judge decides that it's too hot in the courtroom in July in Tennessee, and also the floor of the courtroom is sagging, and maybe it might break. So he says, let's hold court outside on the right outside the courtroom on a stage that was built overnight. So 3,000 people on the 7th day of the trial go outside to hear what's going to happen. And what happens is this. One of the defense attorneys shocked and delighted the throng with one sentence. The defense desires to call Mr. Bryan as a witness. And that was pretty unusual for a prosecutor to take the stand in a trial. But Bryan was more than a prosecutor. He was the leading fundamentalist in America. So he accepted the challenge. But before he did so, he asked the judge to allow him to grill all 3 defense attorneys after he finished. The judge said fine. Defense attorney said fine. So he took the trial. Next slide. This is a depiction of that cross-examination in a movie, 1960, called Inherit the Wind. Anybody ever see this movie? Yeah. Well, then you know how it goes. It was a play before then, 1955. This is Frederick March playing the Bryan character, and Spencer Tracy playing the Darrow character. If you want to be the bad guy in any movie back then, you play opposite Spencer Tracy. Spencer Tracy never played the villain, that I know of anyway. Well, anyway, this is not how it happened. It happened outside, not inside. But anyway, this is how the cross-examination began. You have given considerable study to the Bible, haven't you, Mr. Bryan? Yes, sir, I've tried to, was how it began. For the next 2 hours, Darrow kept Bryan on edge with a cascade of short questions about the trustworthiness of Scripture. Do you believe a whale swallowed Jonah? Do you believe Joshua made the sun stand still? Do you take the story of the flood to be a literal interpretation? Do you think the earth was made in 6 days? Brian didn't give an unqualified yes to any of those questions. He said the whale was only a large fish, and maybe God had not specifically directed it to ingest a man. Neither did Brian speculate about how the Lord had suspended the law of physics long enough to stop the rotation of the earth. And he flatly rejected the notion that the day spoken of in Genesis referred to a period of 24 hours. Brian was an exponent of what was known as the age-day theory of the creation of the world, where each day mentioned in the Bible really spoke about eons of time. Brian evaded direct questions with answers that made him seem thoughtless and dogmatic. When Darrow asked, when did the flood take place? Darrow said, I never made a calculation. Darrow pressed on, what do you think? Brian, I don't think about things I don't think about. The door to ridicule was kind of wide open there. Darrow, do you think about things that you do think about? Answer, well, sometimes. In the trial transcript, the stenographer writes down, laughter in the courtyard. After several minutes of this, one of the prosecutors got frantic, one of Brian's fellow prosecutors. He went to the judge, please stop this. This is not germane to the trial. Because he knew Brian was looking pretty bad. But the judge said, Brian wants to ask these gentlemen questions after Darrow finishes with him. And Brian said, don't worry about it. I want the Christian world to know that any atheist, agnostic, unbeliever can question me any time as to my belief in God, and I will answer him. But so it went on for 2 hours. It was the seventh day of the trial, and obviously Brian should have rested. The next morning, Brian was all ready to cross-examine the defense witnesses. Up steps Clarence Darrow, no fool he. Judge, I'd like to plead guilty. Trial's over. The jury goes out, takes about 10 minutes on deciding on the penalty, decides to fine Mr. Scopes $100, which was the minimum under the law. It was not a criminal law, it was a civil law. The Baltimore Evening Sun, Mencken's employer, immediately agrees to pay the $100. And Scopes ate off or drank off that notoriety for the rest of his life. So Brian had won, but it was a very hollow victory, clearly. A few other states did pass anti-evolution laws in the next few years, but several others thought about passing them and turned them down. And most Americans, even if they remained believers in what we now call creationism, also were able to accept the truths of science at the same time. Making an exception for evolution, perhaps, but nevertheless believing that one had to be scientifically informed as well as religiously informed. And most Americans, were able to separate their belief in God and their belief in science, or find various ways to put them together. Fundamentalists retreated from the public sphere for the most part. Didn't decline in numbers, actually. They in some ways grew, but they focused on building their institutional base of small colleges, of seminaries, publications, radio stations, and so forth. But it's H.L. Mencken's view about Brian and the trial in general which became the dominant one. H.L. Mencken, who was an atheist, who was a cynic, who hated politics, thought most people were stupid, was no Democrat with a small d. But this is what he wrote about Brian, and this is quoted all the time. When you write a more or less empathetic biography of Brian, like I did, you have to deal with this. Mencken wrote, this is his obituary. Brian died 5 days after the Scopes trial. He wrote, Brian seemed only a poor clod like those around him, deluded by a childish theology, full of an almost pathological hatred of all learning, all human dignity, all beauty, all fine and noble things. He was a peasant come home to the barnyard. Brian, said Mencken, was only ambitious. He wasn't sincere. He looked like a dog with rabies in the Dayton courtroom. He, quote, liked people who sweated freely and were not debauched by the refinements of the toilet. So modernists like Brian, like Mencken, cultural relativists in this sense did triumph, at least in this sphere, in the 20s. So the culture wars in the 20s, hard to say one side won, the other side won. It really depends on the issue. I want to play you a quick song, but as you relax from lunch, which is a song from the fundamentalist side, a really good one. But before that, I want to ask if there's any questions or comments.